Why are you doing this?
You did this to yourself. And admitting that is the first step. You're a crackhead. Thing is, this planet and these people, they're your drug of choice. It wasn't that hard to make a universe. At first you just checked in every once in a while. See how the Neanderthals were doing. Move a couple of continents around. But then you got more into it. You started playing a couple of characters of your own. Slaves, kings, messiahs. Pretty soon you were playing 24/7.
How long have I been?
You've been gone for 4,000 years. Not that time means the same for us.
You came looking for me.
That's what a girl does.
Why now?
Because you forgot who you were.
They forgot this wasn't real.
We couldn't just storm in on a fiery chariot. It was your universe. We had to play by your rules. We had to show you how limited and corrupt your little world was. Don't get me wrong, it's a nice place. It's cozy. But do you remember where you came from?
It was warm and white.
You can't describe it with human words.
You can't think it with human thoughts. We need you to come back. With us. Come back with me.
That was Ryan Reynolds in the very Gnostic flick, The Nines, realizing he is God, but still stuck and stranded in demiurge mode. These days, maybe Reynolds is realizing he is Deadpool, as we true Seeker warriors are. Oh, we disfigured, deconstructing demigod rogues, breaking down the fourth wall in all walls of reality. How do we do that? By coming here every week. Where is here? Nowhere? Everywhere. Everywhere? Everywhere and nowhere. Because here is Aeon Bite Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy.
Listen to me. You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
We don't need him.
Each week, I, your host, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird. This is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. But we're often too afraid to do so because Daddy Jehovah and Mommy Gaia said you should stay in your room of complacency, normality, and bigotry. You should be mentally sodomized and not spiritually heard. But no more, for you are the eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. Modern-day Tom Sawyers, champion eternals for all eternity. Oh, you who are both jokers and thieves. As marketing guru Seth Godin said, and he is certainly influenced by Kabbalah, you are very powerful. You just haven't realized it yet. And as sculptor Eric Gill said, the artist is not a different kind of person, but every person is a different kind of artist. You come to the virtual Alexandria to find out you are an artist full of power and can create better than the creator gods and their butt slaves in the establishment.
I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
The demiurge is simply our warped view of the divine, not really the divine itself, as well as our ego drive for limitation and boundary. Whether or not there is a dragon-headed demon between you and the pleroma is not so relevant. Once you clear your inner vision, all archons part away, and you will steal fire from the gods. You will reach the sun, not with wings bound by wax, but by those childhood dreams the elite stole from you, as they tried to make you another brick in the wall. Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3, Worm Your Honor.
If you don't get me, you can't have any pudding! How can you have any pudding if you don't get me?
On this March, the year of our Demiurge 2016, we continue to learn about reaching our X-File potential, not by being ourselves, as New Agers and Disney's Aladdin might want, but by being inauthentic, by shifting those images around us like the Gospel of Philip states, and reinventing ourselves like all children can, as the Gospel of Thomas suggests in many of its sayings. All history's fiction, Alan Moore said. Souls are made of stories and not atoms, Doctor Who said. And reality is anything you can get away with, Edward Pandemonium said on the show. And more, so much more, as we are joined by Eric G. Wilson to discuss his latest and August book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. Eric is certainly one of my favorite scholars in all of the Black Iron Prison, a kindred spirit of sorts. Please check out our past interviews with him that you can find at our YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, and subscription channels. He has discussed a varied number of topics, from William Blake to Gnostic themes in movies, and has written several best-selling books, including Against Happiness, Gnostic Cinema, and Everyone Loves a Train Wreck. Eric is also professor of English at Wake Forest University. For more information on Eric, please visit ericgwilson.net.
Once again, things that could have been brought to my attention yesterday!
And please remember this quote by Colin Wilson. Imagination should be not to escape reality, but to create it. Or as Carl Jung said, without this playing with fantasy, no creative work has ever yet come to birth. The debt we owe to the play of the imagination is incalculable. Or as they say in AA, fake it until you make it. This universe is just one big cosplay party anyway.
This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day. For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death.
You will need this gnosis in this insane world, my beloved truth seekers. A world where people actually analyze movie previews. A world where wars no longer even have rumors. Of GMO food and GMO dreams. Individuality downsizing and mental erectile dysfunction. A world of smartphone worship and Snapchat attention. And where app and Yelp reviews take up most of society's writing energy. The world of Yaldabaoth recently destroying Starman in his last stands. Some of them being Scott Weiland, Echeria S., David Bowie, and Umberto Eco.
People out here, they don't even know the outside world exists. Might as well be living on the fucking moon.
There's all kinds of ghettos in the world.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space.
Nonetheless, you can rise with imagination and being authentic, as Eric will explain. Again, quoting Seth Godin, the realest thing in our lives are the stories we invent. We live with these stories. We remind ourselves of them. We perfect them. And, happily, if you don't like the story you're telling yourself, you can change it. Or as Nietzsche says, and Eric mentions in his book, Keep It Fake, if there is grammar, there is a God. We are that God as we write our own gospel and live our own myth.
As Hemingway said, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self.
So let's go change the story. Let's be Deadpool for a while and do so many fictional wonders. Led us to the interview with Eric on his book, Keep It Fake. As Eric also writes in his book, it's all an illusion, man. Choose your own well.
It's just one story. The oldest.
What's that?
Light versus dark.
Well, appears to me that the dark has a lot more territory.
You know, you're looking at her all in the sky, I think.
How's that?
Well, once there was only dark. When you ask any lights winning.
This is the AM Bide interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having back Eric G. Wilson to discuss his new book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing fine, Miguel. Thanks for having me on your show again.
Always great to have you on back, Eric. Why don't we start with why you wrote the book? You obviously have written books that seem to go against the grain of common perception or the common wisdom, like Against Happiness and even Everyone Loves a Train Wreck. Why did you decide to write this book? And I guess it all starts with a ball, right? The word ball.
That's right. That's right. I opened the book with the sentence, I was the boy who said ball. I was about 6 years old, and I was sitting at the dining room table. And earlier that day, I had a talk with one of my friends about his first word, and I wondered what my first word was. So I asked my mom and dad, and they both in unison said, your first word was ball. Well, I've since done some research, and I find that that's a fairly rare first word. And I wonder if my dad in particular turned some baby babble into that word, because that word would have been very pleasing to him. He was a football coach, had played football, hoped that I would be a football player, and he fit me into a sort of narrative he'd laid out for me from the very beginning. And that the idea that he could inscribe me into his story by saying that was my first word was very important to him. So that's just one of many memories that inspired me to write this book, which is really about how when we are born and as we grow up, when we become aware of ourselves as individuals, by that time we're already inhabiting all these narratives that have been written for us. Our parents' narratives, our community's narratives, all sorts of other narratives. So one of the great goals in life, as I suggest, is trying to forge your own narrative. And that's really what it means to be a self, to be an authentic self, is to imagine your own story, take responsibility for that story, and being willing to endlessly revise that story as you need to as the circumstances of your life change.
And when exactly did you realize this? In your book, you obviously talk about certain points in your life, college and playing football and becoming a teacher. When did it sort of, or is this something that sort of comes out here and there and all of a sudden, before you know it, you're in the narrative of the demiurge and you sort of forget?
Well, I'll say that I guess the main impetus behind my writing of this book is that it's a different way for me to address my lifelong struggle with depression. I've been in and out of psychotherapy. And what I realized about 2 or 3 years ago was that one reason that I wasn't really progressing in my psychotherapy was because I still had this notion that there is an essential self, some sort of innate Eric Wilsonness that I got from birth, and that my great goal in life would be to strip away all of the artifice, all the phoniness, and find that one self. Well, I wasn't finding that self. And in fact, what I concluded was that I'm rather wishy-washy, and I'm changing a lot, and I'm paradoxical, and I'm contradictory. And the quest to find the one consistent self was becoming increasingly frustrating. So luckily I found a psychotherapist who freed me from this myth of the essential self. He said, look, your identity is a construct. He said, think about it. If I ask you, who are you? You probably think about several memories from your past. You think, oh, well, I'm the person that did this at the age of 5, and that led to this event at the age of 7, which led to this event at the age of 15, so on and so forth. In other words, when we start thinking about who we are, we almost unconsciously construct a narrative, a story. Now, of course, that's a highly selective story. How many things have happened to you? Billions. And of those billions of things, how many of those do you actually remember? Well, hundreds of thousands, millions maybe. But when it comes down to you constructing your past, constructing your narrative, you focus on only a handful of those events. So there's a real sense in which our past is something we try to create into a cogent narrative that helps us make sense of who we are right now in the present and helps us imagine the future that we want. In other words, it's as if our identity is a novel of which we're the protagonist, a novel that we're constantly revising as our present moment changes.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Even as we discussed before the interview, you wondered, well, would this book work for Aeon Byte? And even when I got the book, I was reading, I said, well, there's no William Blake. Oh, wait, he mentions the Matrix. I can go with this. But the truth, and we discussed it in our interview about William Blake, is the Neoplatonist notion of imagination. The Neoplatonists said, well, if we look at the stories of the gods and heroes and we start pretending we're them and get the best, we can become gods and heroes. And of course, the Gnostics, they saw this character of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and Judas and said, hey, we're just going to change the narrative and write our own little gospel and we'll start acting like this. So in a way, your book is very Gnostic, isn't it?
Well, that's what I realized as I was writing it, that even though on the surface it suggests that the world of time and space is fake and that we ourselves are fake, what I realize is precisely what you suggest, that okay, let's imagine that everything is fictional, meaning that there's a gap between word and world. Any description we make of the world, scientific, theological, may suggest some truth, but there's no one narrative that can make sense of the world once and for all. So if that's our starting point, that our idea of knowledge is a construct, well, what do you do with that? Well, it can lead to despair. We're alienated from the real. But also it can be exhilarating and liberating because now we have an opportunity to construct our own narrative. Now that's very hard work, as you suggest. So there are many, let's say, demiurgic narratives out there, narratives that attempt to limit our choices, narratives that attempt to tell us we're not free, narratives that suggest we're caught in some sort of causal chain and our whole life is mapped out for us. If I'm a fundamentalist Christian, for instance, I pretty much have a sense that I've gotten it figured out and I have certain rules by which I live, and that's my story. I've become a rather flat character in a rather flat novel. So the Gnostic move, as you suggest, is to imagine fresh narratives that are more flexible and pliable and open and capable of connecting with as many rich experiences as possible. And I do think that the impulse of the first Gnostics to rewrite the book of Genesis or to rewrite the Gospels in such a way that the Judeo-Christian God was called into question or mocked or denigrated is precisely what I'm getting at, that life is art. If you want to have a rich life, create a good piece of art by which you live. In other words, try to live poetically.
Yeah, I certainly couldn't have said it better. And a little segue, this reminds me of when I first got out of rehab and I started going to AA meetings. And they still have this aphorism where they go, fake it until you make it. Have you ever heard of that?
I have.
And my first instance, and that's when I started questioning myself and my narrative, I would be like, wait a second, I've been a liar and a cheat all my life. I've never been authentic, and you're asking me to now be inauthentic, to pretend I'm a good person, a good father, and whatever. But this is really what it's part of it, right, Eric? I mean, you had to go out of therapy and start pretending you were a good father and husband.
Oh, that's right. After years of being in sort of, Jungian, Freudian psychoanalysis, I ultimately concluded that kind of therapy wasn't working for me. And what would work for me is cognitive behaviorism, whose basic precept is, if you want to be happy, don't change your interiors, but just smile more. And the physical action of smiling will eventually generate the happiness you desire. In other words, change your external habits to change the internal. Fake it until you make it. So a perfect example of this, my first 3-4 years of parenthood, that was my time of darkest depression. I was suicidal. I'd gotten diagnosed with bipolar disorder for the first time. It was an awful time, and I was alienated from my wife, and I was having a difficult time connecting with my daughter. And my therapist said, "Look, man, you're just living in a bad novel. You need to change your book, brother. You need to change your novel." And he gave me some exercises. And one of them was recast your relationship with your daughter in such a way that you can feel more comfortable around her. So what I realized is that, I'm a really terrible traditional father. I have no clear moral compass. I'm not really capable of giving her good lessons to live by, but I can make her laugh. I can be silly. I can be stupid. I can be goofy. That was always my thing. So I created a character called Crazy Dad. And my main goal in life was to make my daughter laugh. And it worked. I mean, as we started just being ridiculous together, it allowed us to kind of deepen our relationship, and it evolved certainly into more serious sorts of activities. But it was a perfect moment of how simply putting on a mask, not a mask that's totally different from my impulses, but putting on a mask that kind of focuses my impulses in one way rather than another, was really life-altering for me, and made me a much better parent than I would have been had I stuck with the more traditional narrative of what a parent should be.
And how has the reception been, Eric, or how have others reacted to, especially because, as you write in your book, we do live in a culture where it's all about, like Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, be yourself. We got to be authentic. Gurus are saying that. And our great archetype, again, as you mentioned, is George Washington, and I cannot tell a lie. How have people reacted?
Well, I think a lot of people find these ideas to be troubling. I think that many of us, especially in America, are brought up to believe in a true self, to seek a true self, that the goal in life is to kind of find an identity and be consistent with that identity, to toe the line, to stay the course. And suddenly someone comes along and says, you know what, that's just something made up. What you call yourself is not real. It's not stable. So I would say that many people have reacted kind of negatively for that reason. But after I talk to these folks for a while, usually I can get them excited about the idea that, well, look, if your life isn't going like you want it to go, there is hope. You can make a new life. It's not easy. It's a very difficult undertaking, but you can, if the self is a construct the kind of self you want. Now, does that mean that all constructs are created equally? No. And I would say that this is the second issue that a lot of people have brought up. Aren't you arguing for something that leads to cultural relativism or even subjective relativism? That if each of us is constructing an identity, and one is not any more real than another, well, where does that leave us? Does that mean that the serial killer's narrative is okay? Well, the answer is no. And this is where the idea of the aesthetic comes in a really prominent way. What I suggest in the book is that some narratives foreclose the ability to connect with others. Some narratives are generated by fear. Some narratives are generated by the desire for power. And these narratives tend to be morally bankrupt. They're bad stories, and they lead to division, lead to pain, they lead to suffering. There are other narratives, though, which have a kind of aesthetic richness, like a novel or a poem. And these are narratives that are multiple and nuanced and dense and allow us to connect with as many other narratives as possible that open out into the world and want to create community, and community that tries to create the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So I think we can say then that some lives are simply more artistic than others, and these are the lives that are more ethical and more beautiful and more worthy of imitation.
And getting some examples from your book, why don't we start with someone who's probably most people wouldn't, maybe not, someone wouldn't think about, and that is Bill Murray. Tell us about the Zen of Bill Murray.
Well, Bill Murray is really essential for my own identity construction. I told the story about Crazy Dad, but I think a more powerful part of my own narrative occurred when I was at the United States Military Academy. Upon leaving high school, I was recruited to play football at West Point, and I went. And after 5 minutes there, I realized I wanted to leave immediately. I saw at West Point all the values with which I'd been brought up. Aggression is good. Respect for authority is good. All those sort of very traditional conservative American values were writ large there at West Point, and I recoiled mightily. But I couldn't leave immediately. I had to stay 30 days. Everyone has to stay at least 30 days. Otherwise, most people would leave pretty quickly. So here I was. I knew I was going to be disappointing my father leaving West Point. I was going to be disappointing my family, my community. Here I was, 18 years old, and the self that I identified with, the big man on campus, the star quarterback, was going to go away. So what was I to do? So I became very anxious. I couldn't sleep. Well, by chance, I brought one book with me to West Point. My mom had bought me a book the day before I left because Bill Murray was on the cover. She knew I was a big fan of Bill Murray's comedy. And this is not, art house Bill Murray. This is early Bill Murray of Stripes and Meatballs. So here's a book, Bill Murray. I throw it in my bag, don't think anything about it. Well, about the third or fourth night I'm at West Point, I can't sleep. I crawl in my bunk, I get the book, and by the moonlight and the light of my little Casio watch, I start reading it. And it's not about Bill Murray at all. The book is called The Razor's Edge, about a young man named Larry Darrell who is traumatized in World War I and tries to lead a more spiritual life to help him deal with that trauma. Bill Murray had simply played in a film version of that particular novel. So that novel, that narrative of Larry Darrell, a young man troubled and traumatized and trying to create a new identity through reading philosophy and ultimately ending up in India, really spoke to me and suggested to me new possibilities, new ways of thinking about my life as an intellectual and as a writer. I simply hadn't thought about those possibilities before, and those possibilities stuck and sort of gave me a language to work through that first real, serious mental upset of my life. Now that's a serious side. Since that time, I've been a huge Bill Murray fan, and what I suggest in the book is that there are certain actors, like Bill Murray, certainly. I would probably fit Cary Grant in that role, who suggest through their acting that they know they're acting. What makes Bill Murray so great as an actor is that little smirk, that little glance, that little glint in the eye, that basically tells us, look, the world's pretty ridiculous, the world's pretty silly. I'm playing in a really wacky comedy right now, and I know I'm playing in a really wacky comedy right now. So let's not take it that seriously. In other words, there's a sort of campiness to Bill Murray's performances that I think become a model in a way for us to follow. That yes, we create our identity, we create our role, we write our script, but we shouldn't adhere to it with any sort of fanatical faith. We should not take it that seriously. In other words, we should be playful. We should play with our roles. We should try on roles. And we should get into the kind of, gracefulness of really fabulous slapstick comedy. So that's what Murray is to me in the book. He's just a sort of trickster character, I guess you could say, who constantly suggests to me that maybe I shouldn't take that self that I'm creating right now too seriously. Does that mean that life isn't serious? No, it just means that we should always be willing to sort of laugh at ourselves, to mock ourselves, which can be helpful for opening us up to different ways of thinking about our existence.
Yeah, in your book, you mentioned how Razor's Edge was not a success. And I remember being a teenager and watching it and saying, wow, this is a good movie, but it's just not sticking with me. I can't identify. And as you mentioned, it's because Bill Murray starts enlightened, because he's always in the zone. He's always Zen from beginning to end. It's not like somebody like Keanu Reeves, who has that disturbed, lost look, which is perfect for movies like The Matrix. But Murray, he's already there.
That's right. There's no drama in Razor's Edge because he's already found nirvana, right? He knows it's all Maya, and he's just relaxed with all of it. I've actually grown to love that movie. When I first saw it, I wasn't so intrigued by it, but now I think it's just a fine flick.
Yeah, I need to watch it again. And you also mentioned Cary Grant. I never knew, because again, everybody thinks of this nice, cordial actor, but he really was a split brain, left, right, dualistic kind of person, wasn't he?
Well, he was born in a poor family in Bristol, named Archie Leach. And when he was 11 years old, I think it was, he came home from school and his mom was simply gone. And he thought she had disappeared. That's what the father told him, your mom's gone. Well, it turned out, which he found out about 30 years later, that his dad was having an affair with another woman and wanted to get rid of the mom, so he had her committed to an insane asylum many miles away. Men could do that in those days. So you have this poor boy thinks his mom's abandoned him, named Archie Leach, and eventually he makes his way to Hollywood and creates this identity, Cary Grant. And he was well aware of that. At one point he famously said, everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant. And another time he said, learning to play yourself is the greatest challenge of life. So why Grant's interesting to me is that he very self-consciously created a mask called Cary Grant. But I don't think he took that mask too seriously. He saw it as simply that, a mask. And what makes his acting so powerful, especially in the Hitchcock films, like Notorious or North by Northwest, is that there's that elegant sheen of Cary Grant. But then, as you say, through his glances, through his eyes, through certain gestures, he does suggest a kind of darkness, a kind of turmoil, a kind of tumult, which says to me that he really created a character that was this constant struggle between Archie Leach and Cary Grant. And it's that tension that makes his acting so fascinating to me. Even in his silliest comedies, there's always this sense in Grant that something's not quite right. And I love him. I love him for that. It sounds strange, but I think that Bill Murray is the Cary Grant of our age.
Or they're both sort of dichotomies,
yes,
anti each other, who somehow create the ultimate, I guess, actor archetype, the Abraxas standing above everybody.
That's good, yes.
And speaking of movies, and of course your book touches on so much, but I want to cover some of the points that I saw that could be pertinent to the show. You also, and we've discussed this before, Eric, in our interview on Gnostic themes in movies, you talk about David Lynch and romantic irony. Could you explain a little bit more about this, especially the concept of irony, so misunderstood today?
Yes. Well, as you know, Miguel, and as we've discussed before, there are many different kinds of irony. I won't turn this into an introduction to literature class, but
wouldn't be bad.
Just to give you a sense, one kind of irony is dramatic irony, which occurs when we're watching say a movie or a TV show, and we know information that a character doesn't know. So the character is kind of acting through ignorance, and we're aware of that, and that gives a kind of different layer of meaning to the narrative. That's just one kind of irony. The kind of irony that I'm interested in, though, is called romantic irony, and it was developed in the late 18th, early 19th century through several thinkers, mainly the Schlegel brothers in Germany. And the basic idea of romantic irony is this: that the world, the universe, the cosmos, whatever you want to call it, is simply too big, too abundant, too energetic, too boundless for any one narrative to describe it once and for all. So it goes back to that idea that I was talking about earlier, that there's a constant gap between our representations of the world and how the world really is. For many people, this could lead to despair. Oh my gosh, we can't actually describe reality. But for these romantic ironists, this is an invitation to create. If my description of the world is not fully true, well, that might be frustrating, but also it allows me to describe the world endlessly. Here's an example. So if you and I went on a trip to Greece, and we went to look at an ancient temple, ruins, rubble, columns, and I said, all right, Miguel, imagine what this temple looked like before it fell into ruin. Well, you could imagine forever, because you would never be able to know exactly how that temple looked back in its pristine state. In other words, the fragment would be an invitation to infinite imagination, infinite interpretation, which can be exhilarating and life-affirming. That's the way romantic irony works. Now, what I suggest is that David Lynch, in films like Blue Velvet, in films like Mulholland Drive, is very much aware that we kind of define our lives through Hollywood archetypes. You know, you see in his films a very keen sense of old movies, of archetypal characters, and he's very keen on how we all fit our lives into those sort of old Hollywood archetypes. But he points to the fact that, well, these aren't real, that there's really nothing quite real in a David Lynch film, and that's what makes this film so strange. Everything's just a little bit off, just a little bit off. And Lynch starts in a film like Mulholland Drive to find an ethical element to this idea that we're all living in narratives that we create. And it goes like this. He says that some people are ruled by the marketplace. In other words, they go through life motivated by fear, and they want power. They want material comfort. And they create narratives that help them try to achieve this. And these narratives cut down creativity. They foreclose creativity. So many of Lynch's characters say, like Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, all they want is power. So they try to reduce those around him to pawns in their power game. In contrast, there are characters like Jeffrey Beaumont in Blue Velvet who push against what he calls the marketplace and create the multiverse. That's the phrase, the term, the multiverse. The idea that you can create a narrative that is multiple and open and kind of attuned to the craziness and the chaos of experience as it really is. And these are people who live more artistically and they live more ethically, because ultimately the way they live opens up spaces for others to create as well, as opposed to trying to shut down the creativity of others. So in this regard, Lynch becomes a sort of Gnostic hero for me, a sort of Blakean poet, if you will, of cinema.
Oh, I would certainly agree, and it's fascinating that the term irony comes from the Greek word of this actor who was always sort of an anti-Damon, a Iago. He's always bringing the character to his doom, right?
Well, that's right. The word irony comes from the Greek iron, which simply means to dissimulate. But you're right. In stock Greek and Roman comedy, there was always a character called the iron, who was the trickster. He would often be, say, the servant of a soldier who wants to have power and heroism and wants to woo the most beautiful woman. And the iron pretends to help the hero win the woman, but in fact he himself will win the woman because he's constantly mocking in a very subtle way what the soldier's doing. So the Iron is precisely the trickster. The Iago character is certainly in a kind of a darker example of that, but even someone like Charles Chaplin, or let's be especially kind of flippant, Bugs Bunny, right?
Of course.
These are the characters that we endlessly find intriguing because they upset master narratives. They upset the narrative of the marketplace, which is all about gaining power, and they open up a space for play and transgression and rebellion.
So they definitely can serve as a daemon, of course. They're not.
Yes. Yes.
It depends on who's writing the story, and certainly tying in with romantic irony and how constructing all these edifices in the multiverse, we'd have to look at the work which you mentioned of very Gnostic-minded Jorge Luis Borges and Jean Brady. I can never.
Baudrillard.
Yes, which of course he's quoted in The Matrix and The Desert of the Real. Maybe could you tell us your views on The Desert of the Real and these two giants?
Well, so Borges is very interesting in this regard. He talks about how in a story like Funes Memorias that you have this character, this young man who, after a horse riding accident, finds it impossible to forget anything. Therefore, he's incapable of abstract thought. He just can't believe that a dog at 3:15 in the afternoon is the same as a dog at 3:16 in the afternoon, because he perceives both with such extreme specificity that they seem to him to be radically different. In other words, he's incapable of abstract thought. And this ultimately leads him to lead a very painful life and to die young. The idea being that we need to create mental categories that allow us to kind of abstract from extremely concrete experience. Well, these abstractions are constructs to a certain extent. And Borges explores this idea in another story, Tuan Uqbar and Orbis Tertius, where he suggests that this group of kind of totalitarian ideologues in the 19th century try to create an encyclopedia for a world that doesn't exist. But eventually, because the encyclopedia is so well described, this world starts to exist, meaning that the ideas of our mind, those abstractions, take on reality. So reality is indeed idea. Idea precedes reality, creates reality. So that takes us back to what we were saying just a minute ago. This is why Gnostic ideas are so powerful, because they're ultimately, almost all Gnostic myths are about liberation from any kind of shutting down of human potentiality. So if you're going to create an ideology that ultimately tries to favor the few over the many, that's one kind of construct. So we need to create constructs that favor the many over the few. And that's again where, the imagination comes in, that we should try to think about the world as a really rich, fecund work of art, that is an invitation for others to create works of art. And I think that's one of this kind of, lasting ideas of Borges. I think Baudrillard's a little darker. He's a little more skeptical. I don't see as much hope in his work. He seems to suggest that we're all, simulacra, that basically, in our society of hypermedia, that we are always imitating some sort of narrative handed down from us, from the media. We're basing our lives on the lives of characters in film. We're basing our appearance on models we see on television and on our computers. And there's a sense in Baudrillard that we can't get out of this, that we are kind of trapped in this world where we're simply imitating images. Certainly in The Matrix, the Wachowski brothers take those ideas, though, and turn them in a more optimistic direction, suggesting that we can break out finally out of the Matrix into the real.
Do you ever get this? Sometimes people always say, well, the Gnostics seem so nihilistic and even existentialist. And I tell them, yes, they certainly were, or they toyed with it. It's almost like they had to look into the abyss until the abyss looked into them and decide, okay, maybe it's all meaningless. We need to start doing something, and that something is adding meaning to this cold universe. Is this maybe what your book and these authors and artists are trying to do?
Yes, I think one of the presuppositions of my book is that life itself has no meaning. There's no inherent meaning in life, but we attribute meaning to the world. We project meaning onto the world. And yeah, one could say, well, that's nihilistic because there's no inherent value in the world. There are no stable truths. There are no stable moral principles. But I would say that the possibility that we don't find meaning but make meaning, again, gives us a great opportunity to express our human agency. We can make the world mean. We can't make it mean anything we want to. Things happen, right? People get cancer. People have certain DNA strands. People are born with bipolar genes. Things happen. But we have a choice how we'll make those things signify. Let me give you an example. So let's you and I move away from Greece and looking at the temple, and let's go stand on the top of a cliff overlooking an ocean. And if I push you off into the ocean, well, what's going to happen? Gravity's going to push you down. There's nothing you can do about it. That happens. That's a given. But you can choose how you're going to fall, right? You can flail wildly and do a belly flop, or you can do a graceful swan dive or jackknife. In other words, there are givens, but we can choose how we're going to turn or inflect or make mean those various givens. So I think it's important to get that we don't find value, we make value. And that's could be pessimistic if you want to go through life finding stable value. But I think it's ultimately optimistic because it allows us to imagine the kind of world we want to imagine. And hopefully we'll imagine a world that has a kind of generosity and beauty, and that opens up opportunities instead of closes them down.
As you write, this is very much like Bill Murray and Meatballs when he's trying to get the camp members excited about some competition that they're probably going to lose, and he's just screaming, "It just doesn't matter, just doesn't matter. Just go out there and live that story."
Well, and that gets us to, we can talk, my book doesn't really overtly address in Buddhism, but I think that moment in Meatballs is beautifully Zen, right? It just doesn't matter, which has two meanings. On the one hand, it just doesn't matter because your desire to have victory is silly. That doesn't matter. Who cares if you win or lose or not? That's the flippant meaning. But there's a more serious meaning which suggests that what you think of as stable matter doesn't exist. Right? There's no such thing as stable matter, as it were, that shapes your life. So I just love that. And there's so many moments in Bill Murray films. And Jim Jarmusch captures this beautifully in Broken Flowers, the kind of Zen of Bill Murray. Just the way his characters, and even Murray in his own life, if you hear him interview, is so good at just sort of settling into the present moment. Being fully present and not trying too hard to wrench experience into one program or another, but just sort of, opening up to what comes next. And I think that's what gives his performances that relaxed feeling, that's so engaging for me anyway.
A concept that is very important with your book, and you seem to go full circle with, is the idea of Dada. Could you explain a little bit about that, Eric?
Sure. Well, so in the after World War II, there were several thinkers in Europe who thought the world had just gone to hell. Civilization had generated World War I and World War II. So traditional ways of thinking were bankrupt. So we had to think about ways to escape traditional ways of thinking. Well, what did this mean? Simple rebellion ultimately reinforces the master narrative, right? So if you say no and I say yes, and if you say dark and I say light, then ultimately you're still controlling the narrative. In other words, we're caught into some kind of binary. And most forms of rebellion take that form, right? The government's wrong, we are right. So the Dadaists wanted to kind of push to a third term. They wanted to find ways to get beyond that the language entirely. So they came up with all this really kind of wacky stuff. There's one group of Dadaist or Dadaist influenced group known as the Situationists, who would say take out a map of a Sunday and sort of close their eyes and point to a place on the map and go, oh, okay, let's go there. And they would go just walk around that part of the city. The idea being that we're not walking around for any reason. We're not going anywhere. We don't have a purpose. We don't have a program. And when we walk around that way, we experience the world with a kind of intensity and with a kind of richness that we wouldn't experience if we were going somewhere. So that's just one of many ways that the Dadaists tried to sort of shut down meaning making, shut down traditional meaning making, kind of make philosophy and theology and literature mute and stupid, in hopes of finding new expressions and new ways to be. And yeah, so surrealism would be an example of this, certainly. And you can see how like you think of the work of Salvador Dali, would be a perfect example, of this kind of art.
What would be some modern examples that you can think of, Eric, for the listener?
Well, I would actually say that David Lynch. I think David Lynch's cinema has a Dadaistic feel, because it seems on the surface to be so ridiculous. You think of Inland Empire, the scenes of the rabbits in the sitcom. You're watching this film, it's like, what? These are rabbits ironing clothes? There's something so ridiculous about David Lynch's films. You think of the Mechanical Robin at the end of Blue Velvet. You think about the over the top soap opera-esque performances in Twin Peaks. There's a real way in which David Lynch's films are ridiculous. They're silly. They're stupid. But it's precisely those qualities which I think force us to rethink our relationship to the world. It's almost like the films make us stupid in a good way. Stupid in that the way we used to make sense of the world doesn't work anymore in the Lynch multiverse. So we have to come up with a new language, a new way. And that's, I guess that's the value of Dadaism. It's so shocking and so strange and so bizarre, that it almost sort of startles us and shakes us out of traditional ways of seeing. It defamiliarizes the familiar. I'll put it that way. You see a David Lynch film and then you go back to your everyday life. Things don't seem the same anymore. I mean, you walk out of some films, you sit in the theater and you watch, say, Blue Velvet, and you come out of the theater and into the street, and suddenly that street world feels unreal and dreamlike.
Yeah, it made me afraid of ants. I thought I was going to hear bugs under the grass.
That's right. That's right.
So what do you think of the reboot of Twin Peaks, or does that annoy you as much as it annoys me that they're rebooting or redoing Blade Runner?
Well, I'm guardedly optimistic about Twin Peaks. I don't know. Lynch hasn't made film in a long time, so we'll see. I hope he can live up to his past reputation. I have to admit ignorance. I didn't know there was a reboot of Blade Runner.
The sequel, actually. There is a sequel, and Harrison Ford is going to be in it, and some people have said it's the most unnecessary sequel in the history of Hollywood.
Well, I would fully agree with that, and I think I'd probably agree with that about Twin Peaks. I don't think we need another Twin Peaks. I think we're good, really, with season 1.
Oh, exactly.
of the old Twin Peaks. And yeah, I mean, you and I probably both think that Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott Blade Runner of 1982, is sacrosanct. I mean, it's certainly been one of the most important films or works of art in my history. So, yeah, I'm none too excited about seeing Harrison Ford at 70, Deckard roll himself back out. I don't know. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, but I guess it goes to the question of the movie, and I guess it really ties into your book and the interview. Is Deckard a replicant or is he a human? But your book would make the case that, yes, we are all replicants.
Well, I didn't talk about Blade Runner in my book, but I kind of wish I had now that you mention it. And I do write about Blade Runner in my film Secret Cinema, Gnosis of David Lynch, which we've talked about before. And I think what Ridley Scott is suggesting in that that film is that ultimately the distinction between replicant and human is not biological. In other words, the possibility that I am organic and you're inorganic, that doesn't matter so much, because those who are organic, the so-called real people, can be morally reprehensible in that film, whereas the replicants who are not organic, like Roy Batty, are full of life and energy and beautiful. So I think that the Ford character Deckard realizes that at the end of the film, when he falls in love with the Sean Young character. He ultimately says, "I don't care that you're not organic. You're the kind of creature that I love, and I myself might be a replicant." I think when he sees the origami unicorn at the end of the film, he realizes that. He gives that little grin, like, well, maybe I'm a replicant too, but it doesn't matter. So it's a perfect example of what I'm arguing in the film, that sort of artifice and reality have no basis in the material world. They're mental categories, and you can choose to inhabit one or the other. And ultimately, the mental categories that are the most important, as Blade Runner suggests, is finding a way to fall in love and be in love and treat another with compassion and affection.
Yeah, to find meaning, as we've talked about.
Exactly. Yeah.
There is also a I thought it was a very powerful scene in your book where you're with a friend and he simply turns around and he says, "It's all an illusion, man. Choose your own well."
That's right. That was an important moment. We were out for a hike and we were talking about James Joyce or Virginia Woolf one, and it was one of those wonderful moments where he just blurted this thing out of the blue. It's like, "Yeah, man, it's all illusion." just make sure you choose a good one. And as silly as that was then, it really is kind of the centerpiece of the book. And of course, the fact that it's the name of a Guns N' Roses album.
Oh yeah.
Choose your illusion. I don't really know what to do with that, but
just use it, weave it into the narrative. I mean, at least your friend didn't push you off and gravity took on. So that was
That's right.
And do you, for your students or for people who want, I know it sounds silly and you're looking for an exact answer, who want exercises into this and to sort of living an authentic life? I mean, for example, I always tell people when they want to find about Gnosticism, one of the things they need to do is write your own gospel. Just write your own version of the Jesus story and see where you fall into this. Are there any exercises you give your students like this?
Well, I over the past 5 years, I started teaching creative writing workshops. I teach creative nonfiction. And in that class, we're especially attuned to the idea that even if one is writing memoir, one still constructs an I. Even nonfiction is kind of a construct, because the persona that you inscribe into that piece of writing, it's partly you, but not fully you. So we talk a lot about identity construction as a really important presupposition for writing literature. Certainly for fiction and poetry, that's the case, but even for writing nonfiction. So we do spend a lot of time writing narratives of our lives, like, I say, like, what's your favorite memory? And they'll describe their favorite memory. And I say, well, why? Why did you choose that memory over all the other memories? And that gets them thinking about how they've constructed an identity based on this narrative they have going. And I think they find it very liberating and empowering. Now, in my other more traditional literary classes, in which I usually teach romanticism, I'm teaching people like Blake, of course. And I talk to my students a lot about how most colleges these days have really, really kind of prominent career planning and placement offices who attempt to help the students brand themselves. This is the language that's actually used, if you can believe it. The idea being that when I come out of Wake Forest, which is where I teach, I'll be branded as a Wake Forest graduate, and that will mean that I have these qualities that will be valuable in the job market. So I say to my students, how does that make you feel that you're being stamped with the Wake Forest brand? How can you push against this? How can you sort of create your own individual narrative that allows you, to come out of Wake Forest as a graduate, but also be an individual, to be unique? So, I really feel like 19, 20, 21-year-olds, they're at a really pivotal time, right? When identity construction is much on their mind, moving from the high school world to the adult world. So I really think that the ideas in my book can really be very helpful for them, I hope, in thinking more rigorously about identity construction.
Yeah, in this day and age, it certainly makes a lot of sense. And why the cover? For some reason, I am fascinated by the cover, the pair with the green paint.
Yes. Well, my publisher for Astral and Giroux, they actually have an art team who put that together. I had nothing to do with it, but I love it. I love the striking green colors, and yeah, so you have this pair, and there seems to be wax or paint being drizzled over the pair, which really, first of all, it's very eye-catching, I think, and secondly, it does get you thinking about, what's the relationship between, the wax covering of the pair and the actual pair. I think it's one of the more tantalizing covers of any book I've had. When I first saw it, I thought, well, I don't really know what that means exactly, but then I thought, well, I think that's a good thing because it gets their attention.
And to end, what are you working on next? What are you going to maybe offend American culture with next, Eric? I mean, against apple pie, against.
I tell you, Miguel, I'm going the way of Borges and Kafka. I've decided to write fiction. So I'm currently composing. I would say sort of Gothic weird tales, in the tradition of Borges and Kafka. I want to put aside my nonfiction for a while. As much as I've enjoyed making these counterintuitive arguments, sort of in honor of the ideas of my book, I want to challenge myself and open myself to the multiverse. I feel like I myself have become a little bit predictable. So it's time to break into a new narrative.
And maybe like Nabokov, you'll find out that your characters will realize they're in a fiction novel and start talking to you.
If I'm lucky, that's true.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Eric. I'd like to thank you very much for once again honoring Aeon Byte, and this time to discuss your august and wonderful book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life.
You're welcome, Miguel. Always a pleasure to be on your show. Great conversation.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy on a weekly basis.